The Lectionary. The Old Testament reading for the 14th Sunday after Pentecost is from Ezekiel chapter 33. So you, son of man, I have made a watchman for the house of Israel. Whenever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them warning from me. If I say to the wicked, O wicked one, you shall surely die, and you do not speak to warn the wicked to turn from his ways, that wicked person shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. But if you warn the wicked to turn from his ways, and he does not turn from his ways, that person shall die in his iniquity, but you will have delivered your soul. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Synopsis. Ezekiel, like Jeremiah, comes from the time period slightly before and during the exile of the Israelites to Babylon. However, unlike Jeremiah, who escaped to Egypt, Ezekiel was taken to Babylon with an early group of Israelites, which included King Jehoiakim, so that his prophecy was also directed back to Israel and the people still residing there, until King Nebuchadnezzar exiled them to Babylon with the rest of their compatriots. In this short text itself, God first reminds Ezekiel of his call to be a prophet of God, which makes him responsible to proclaim God's warning to Israel, even those back in Judea. However, the extent of this warning includes the answer to the question that has troubled God's people, including Christians, to this very day. The question is, am I my brother's keeper? The answer to that question is an emphatic yes. Not only are all God's people responsible for warning those people around them of their sin against God and its consequences, but they do so under penalty of their own salvation. But his blood I will require at your hand leaves no doubt of the dire consequences of failing to warn others of their dire circumstances due to their actions against God's will and commandments. This responsibility, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. And even these dire consequences, for it is necessary that temptation comes, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes, are echoed in the gospel reading for today, and even the epistle reading bears some of these same cautions. This text requires our attention as we, God's witnesses in this place at this time, consider our actions and responsibilities to the people around us. The epistle reading is from Romans chapter 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment, are summed up in these words: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. This too is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Synopsis. As St. Paul continues to describe the Christian's life in his letter to the Roman Church, we find this all reminiscent to Martin Luther's discussion of the fourth commandment. In some senses, it might be slightly more difficult for us to understand this discussion of a Christian's reaction to civil government without considering the context of the governments that existed at the time that both St. Paul and Martin Luther exhorted Christians to be good citizens. Although there was a time in this country when Lutherans felt that it was difficult to be a good Christian and to work for the government at the same time. The concern was about divided loyalties. This was especially poignant during World War II, when the belt buckle of German soldiers wore the emblem Gott mit uns, God with us, and Christian churches in America and England, in a burst of national pride, displayed national flags and sang, "Onward, Christian soldiers." One must remember that the governments of St. Paul's era routinely sponsored religions and even believed the heads of their government to be divine. For example, the Roman Caesars. After all, even the Pharisees, putting Jesus to the test, asked, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. Tell us then, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Because they felt Jesus would have to reply no or be unfaithful to God. Even his answer, "And Jesus said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's," probably caused more confusion in this matter than it cleared up, because it seemed to place governments in direct opposition to God. After all, the Herodians and the Pharisees' disciples were just trying to trap Jesus and get him arrested by the Romans, and Jesus was just answering their question in a way that would defuse their trap without giving them more ammunition against him. However, Paul's purpose here is to show that God has established all civil authorities to punish evildoers and to reward those who do good. In doing so, he shows that Christians have nothing to fear from government, even governments that support another god. Then he enumerates the things that we are to render to Caesar, because they are proper and just for Christians to do. Still, he does not stop there, by just certifying that God does not only approve civilian governments, but appoints them to carry out his will. Paul also includes this as a Christian duty, to show our love to one another. By owing nothing to anyone except to love them, Paul asserts that being a good citizen is just another way to serve one another in God's love. After citing several of the commandments, he then cites God's summation of the commandments: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your might, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and assert that to be a good citizen is to love your neighbor. The Holy Gospel and the basis of our meditation for today is from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 18th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. At that time the disciples came to Jesus, saying, Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he called to him a child, and he put them in the midst of them and said, Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world for temptations to sin, for it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the world by whom the temptation comes. And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man came to save the lost. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains, and go search for the one that went astray? Truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Synopsis. This text recounts one of several times when the disciples get into a discussion about who is the greatest among them in the kingdom of heaven. Of course, Jesus does not point out that he is by far the greatest of this group, but once again points out that having the humility to know that none of us have any standing before God and that we need his redemption is what places us in good in heaven. Since much of this is covered in the sermon, I will not reiterate that here, but mention other things of interest to us in this text. There is, of course, the discussion of abandoning physical blessings on earth, sight, mobility, etc., for the blessings of heaven. Added to this is the warning against offending others, rather than remembering that Jesus came to die for their salvation too. For Jesus indeed has come to redeem every single sinner. Does not he leave the 99 on the mountain and go in search of the one that went astray? A portion of this text, verses 15 through 17, are important in the functioning of our church body because they are our prescription of how we deal with unrepentant sinners. While the process is a good one, even if it has been abused at times, we need to examine more closely the end of this process described in verse 17, C and D. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Unfortunately, too many people have taken this to mean that at that point we can excommunicate the offending sinner and wash our hands of them. This is unfortunate because it fails to take into account that St. Matthew himself, while not being a Gentile, had at one point been treated like one because he was a tax collector, a profession hated by his fellow Jews because of its association with the Romans. St. Matthew is reminding us that nothing relieves us of our duty to witness to God's great love for every sinner, no matter if they are a lapsed Christian or not.